Well, hey, everybody, and welcome to Fireside Fridays. Happy Friday to you. Yes, I do have a guest here. Don't worry, you're just not stuck with me for the next half hour, 45 minutes. But I did want to just quickly start off by saying thank you all who have participated in the hashtag Spook Yourself campaign that we have done this week, which with hard work and draw your monster. Yay! It's been so much fun, and lots of people have done it. And by the way, you still have a full day till the end of tomorrow to participate. So this is what you do. You video or photo yourself doing something that scares you. I ate a pepper without washing it, emetophobia. And then you tag 3 friends, and then you tag us and post it on your social media. So the OCD Gamechangers, hard work, draw your monster, and then you donate. It's optional, but we're asking to make a donation to OCD Gamechangers. With that said, before I bring on my guest today, I just wanted to quickly say OCD Gamechangers is a nonprofit. We do take donations. All donations go to our programming. We are amping up a lot of our programming, as you can probably tell recently. Lots of campaigns, lots of working with different organizations to help promote them and elevate them. We're also doing an initiative for the thought leader groups, focus groups focusing on financial barriers to treatment, teaching and educating therapists who say they treat OCD, and also trying to get into schools to change the academia. And we're also building a referral list. Any of your donations are going to go to the initiatives towards that. There's also the opportunity to sponsor either Fireside Chats or Monday Mavericks. So if you want to be a sponsor, we can talk about you or your organization or your practice each week that we come on. So if you're interested, please head over to ocdgamechangers.com, make a donation, or reach out to us at ocdgamechangers@gmail.com. With that said, I'm going to bring on our guest for today. Oh gosh, look, I just got anxiety about pronouncing it.
Okay.
But I'm going to try it anyway. Today we have Tatyana Mestechkina.
We'll take that. Yeah. Hi.
Yay!
Hello. It's so exciting to be here. Thank you for having me. Yes, you have it spelled out phonetically. It's okay. I was telling you before that some of my really good friends are still working on it decades later. So.
Well, Tatyana, I'm so excited to have you here. We've known each other probably, I think we connected like a little over a year ago.
Yeah. We got to meet in Texas for an amazing event as well.
Yes, the brainstorming session. That's right. I'm so excited about this topic. I'm so glad it's something that you're passionate about. So I'm going to have you just really quick introduce yourself, and then I'll explain to everybody what Fireside Chats are.
Sounds good. So I'm Dr. Tatyana Mestechkina. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I have a private practice called CBT for Better Living, and we specialize in treating OCD, OC spectrum disorders like BDD, trichotillomania, etc., as well as all types of anxiety disorders.
Excellent. Well, if you are here for the first time, or if you're joining us, because you usually join us for Firesides, hey, everybody. If you're here for the first time, then let me just explain a little bit about what Fireside Chats are. Every other week, we bring on individuals in the OCD community that are really passionate about specific topics that we feel like really need to be talked about. There's so much complexity when it comes to OCD and treatment and everything surrounding that. And sometimes I feel like other than just getting diagnosed, getting treated, trying to work towards recovery, there's a lot of little nuances that happen in all the different cracks. So we bring people on who are experts to talk about these things, talk about what's passionate to them. So that's what Fireside Chats are. And today we are going to talk about barriers and exposure response prevention treatment, which is the evidence-based treatment for OCD. So Tatyana, first I want to ask, what was it that made you get into treating OCD in general?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So even though I had a handful of cases where I treated OCD in graduate school, I think where I really fell in love with it and dove into the deep end of OCD was when I did my internship with Dr. Steve Phillipson. And it was just an amazing training experience. I think before that, I didn't realize like how eclectic OCD could be and how creative the brain could be and all the different themes that it presents itself and how sneaky some of the rituals can be as well, especially where people have Puro, which is the subtype of OCD where they experience obsessions, but the compulsions aren't things like washing their hands or checking the stove or the doorknob, but really things that are not usually observable. And I think just working with so many people where their OCD symptoms were either misdiagnosed or missed completely, or where they spent years, sometimes even decades, suffering in silence, believing that they're this horrible person because they're having these horrible thoughts. And it was just so rewarding to be able to be on the journey with so many patients and help them discover OCD, understand it, and have therapy that's effective in helping them kind of get their lives back. And I think that's also part of the selfish reason for me really enjoying this type of work, because it's so rewarding for me as a therapist to be able to see that week to week, people finding kind of relief often from just having a name for what they're experiencing, knowing that there's other people experiencing it. And I think you've done incredible work in helping people realize that as well. And knowing that we have evidence-based therapy that works. Not easy work, but if people commit to it and go all in, they're able to get their lives back and have freedom from this disorder. And that's just been so inspiring and rewarding for me.
Well, I definitely want to say that is not, you're not selfish. How awesome is it to be a therapist, to be able to, really watch people who are just suffering tremendously and for years have such gains, even sometimes within a couple weeks or months.
It's
That is,
amazing.
it is, I
Yeah.
commend you
And the
for doing
gains
this
gains
work.
are some things that we are often really substantial. Like I worked with this woman who was a grandmother and probably had OCD as far back as she can remember in childhood. And because she was having intrusive thoughts about hurting her grandkids, throwing them in the river, putting them into the oven, and she's the sweetest lady who loved them with all her heart. And because of that, she ended up missing years of experience bonding with them because of that, and being able to see her rebuild her relationship with them is just amazing.
Well, I think this is a great lead into what is exposure response prevention. I know that I think the importance of this topic is there's so much confusion around what the treatment is for OCD, but then there's also so much confusion and also fear mongering around exposure response prevention. Now, just so y'all know, Tatyana worked with Dr. Stephen Philipson, who was my therapist, who is notoriously known to be a tyrant. No, I'm just kidding. Kidding, Steve, if you're watching. No, he had this really, and I was terrified to go into ERP, and he had this really incredible way of just hooking into the motivation piece that was I guess compassionate, but also stern. And that's what I needed. I needed someone who could balance the two, make me feel like it's going to be okay, but also like, hey, if you don't do the work, you're just prolonging the suffering. So he is just just want to take a moment to say that Philipson is just an absolute gem, and we are so lucky to have him in the community. So yeah, I'm so glad that you found him. And
Yeah, absolutely.
but yeah, let's talk to us a little bit about exposure response prevention, and then we're going to get into some barriers. I also kind of want to get into some myths about it, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'll be really helpful to kind of jump into the details of it that often get missed. So exposure and response prevention is a type of cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's considered really the gold standard of treatment for OCD. There's really a ton of research to support its efficacy in that way. And I think before going into what ERP is, just kind of a oversimplified version of what OCD is that we all have this part of our brains called the amygdala, which sends us signals when there's some sort of threat that it thinks that it's in the environment. So if a tiger was in the room with us, both of our amygdalas would be lighting up saying, danger, 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 get out of there as fast as you can, run away. And if you can't, fight, throw furniture, do what you got to do. So amygdala, amazing, helpful, keeps us alive, right? If the amygdala wasn't giving us those signals and a tiger was in the room and we're like, hey, let's watch Netflix, hang out, we would be dead very quickly. So while people with OCD have very well functioning amygdalas that are going to protect them when there is a real threat, the amygdala misfires and sends them these false alarm signals of it's something being threatening when it's not actually threatening or very unlikely to be threatening. And what's really tricky with OCD is that when that false alarm signal happens, it doesn't do a great job communicating with the logical, rational part of our brain. And if anything, the more we try to use logic and reason, often the more intense the symptoms get. So ERP is really sort of like a backdoor strategy. We know using logic and reason, which is natural and intuitive and works for most of life's problems, isn't helpful when it comes to OCD. So instead, we work on kind of retraining the brain, right? And therapy, I kind of look at it as two-part, reactive and proactive. And the reactive part is really getting people equipped with different tools and strategies for what to do when the intrusive thoughts and feelings come up. And they're all kind of, even though they're different variations of the tools, they're all often under the umbrella of we have to treat these thoughts and feelings as irrelevant, even though they feel super dangerous, threatening, and brain doesn't always agree. And then the proactive part is the exposure part where we do creative things to sort of show brain that not only are we willing to experience these unwanted thoughts and feelings and not give them the power, but we're also going to create scenarios where we go towards them to practice building those muscles and to show our brains that these threats are no longer going to be treated as threats that way.
I'm so relieved because what you just described is almost exactly what I describe to people. And so I just feel
you got it.
I feel very assured.
Yes.
And it's so funny that you mentioned like the when the amygdala is misfiring, it's it's the rational part. I always tend to tell people like the last thing that you want is your reptilian brain and your executive functioning like mingling at a cocktail party. Like
exactly. They're not good friends when it comes to OCD episodes at all.
All hell is going to break loose.
Yeah.
So could you give us an example of what it would look like, maybe with harm OCD, if someone's coming in and they're starting therapy or maybe even like, a few weeks into therapy, what does that look like? So we talked about reactive and then the proactive piece. This is where people go, oh no, like I've been avoiding this for 12 years, Tatyana. I don't want to face this.
Yeah.
So what do I do? So tell us what that looks like and what the experience of the person is.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think before even kind of jumping into the deep end of designing exposures or implementing them, I think the first step in therapy is really to lay a solid foundation and the person really understanding what is OCD, how does it work, what feeds the OCD, and what leads you to have more freedom from OCD. And before even doing any of the exposures, I make sure that I and whoever I'm working with are really on the same page about that, right? You can build the strongest, best top of the line house, but if the foundation is not great, it's going to collapse. So I think really understanding why we're doing things that are the opposite of everything they've ever wanted to do is really crucial. Essentially, we're saying like, hey, over there, that looks like a cliff, and everything in your mind and body is saying, don't walk off the cliff, you're going to fall and die. But I promise there's an invisible bridge. And if you walk through it, it'll get you towards the life that you want to live, right? And I always tell people, as much as I appreciate any vote of confidence they have in me, I always want them to really question everything, really learn everything, and before they jump on board to doing any of the exposures. And I think, a big part of that is really the biggest misconception that people often come into therapy thinking is that our goal is to cure OCD or to get rid of unwanted thoughts and feelings. And the bad news is that there is no cure for OCD, and definitely be skeptical of anyone who tells you otherwise.
Yes.
But the good news is we have really great therapy that works. And instead of eliminating the thoughts and feelings, we're really learning to better manage that, right? So some of the tools that people might develop are learning how to first identify some of the red flags for OCD, because OCD, as you know, can be really tricky. And often, I tell people if 100% of the time, with 100% certainty that you have OCD, then it's not OCD in that way. Doubt, uncertainty, hallmark feature of it.
Yeah.
So the first step is really just becoming more informed for what those red flags are and increasing your risk tolerance, that even if it has a 0.1% chance of being OCD, taking the risk and treating it as such. And, often that involves tools like learning to let the thoughts and feelings be there without doing anything for them, about learning how to make room for the uncertainty, the not knowing for what may or may not happen. Like, and I use the example of like harm OCD. So, the let it be there method would be like, okay, I'm noticing the thought that I might harm my child, for example. The other strategy might be like, I'm going to let this possibility be a possibility. And then kind of more aggressive approaches like turning up the volume, where we take the thought and we kind of play around with it and we say, hey, brain, I see your this, and I raise it to a whole other level, and I can get even more creative and come up with an even more creative version of your false alarm signal, just to show you how okay I am with that uncertainty being there. And then we come up with creative ideas for ways to practice showing the brain our willingness to take risks. So it might look like, a person having a knife in the same room as their child at first, or, chopping up some vegetables in the same room, while letting brain do its thing, bring up any version of those thoughts, any version of those feelings, making room for the physiological discomfort that comes up. And then sometimes, bonus points for kind of poking at brain and egging it on as well.
Oh, thank you. That's great. And hi, Erin. Erin Harvey's here. Hey, you commented, Doc. Yay. Yes, when you were saying, with the therapist, it's kind of like, oh, okay, go jump off that cliff and there's an invisible bridge. I often think in my own ERP, or when I'm talking to people, it's when you're working with someone who, you've got to trust the process. If there's a firewall in front of you and recovery is on the other side, you've got to trust that the therapist is saying, walk through the fire and you're not going to get burned. Because the worst thing that people can do, and this is a great segue into the barriers, the worst thing that people can do is to walk halfway into the fire and stop and go, uh-oh, I don't think this is going to work because the fear's too high, because that's when you feel the burn. That's when you feel it. So in ERP, it's so important to work with someone who is a specialist, who understands this, and who you trust. And I always say, too, that ERP therapists aren't the nicest people on the planet.
No.
Personally, y'all are.
We have some sadistic tendencies, maybe.
but you have to be, like I said before with Steve, you have to be compassionate but firm. You have to have that trust, but also I'm going to shove you through the firewall a little bit, so that way you can see that it really, really is safe. So with that said, I know for me, there were a lot of barriers to treatment, barriers to ERP. It was oh my gosh, is ERP going to teach me that all the thoughts are real? Is treatment going to prove that all the thoughts are real? Is the therapist really going to believe that the thoughts are real? So all these things come up. And I think today we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the behavioral barriers of what happens kind of during therapy that can really make people get into there and then almost feel like it's being sabotaged. Is that the right way to put it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think just to kind of piggyback from what you're saying, one of the keys to success in treatment is the follow through, right? If someone says like, okay, I'm going to do this exposure, but oh my gosh, please don't feel anxious, or I really hope I don't have any intrusive thoughts or images when I do that, our brains are going to call out our bluffs in 5 seconds. And if anything, that becomes counterproductive and even reinforces those thoughts, right? So if someone, going back to the example they were saying with harm OCD, if someone starts chopping up those vegetables and has that knife while their child is in the room, and then they experience as an exposure, and then they experience an intrusive thought like, oh my gosh, what if you really do want to stab your son with this knife? And then they put that knife away or hide in a drawer or give it to their partners or something, that actually sends the opposite message to the brain. Then the brain is like, wow, that knife must have been really dangerous. I'm doing such a great job warning this person. Good thing they put the knife away. Otherwise, their kid would be dead right now. Blood would be everywhere in that way. So that consistency and follow through is really, really important. And for people to really subscribe to the spirit of it, right? Exposures are not just about white knuckling it and just getting through it and saying, check, I did it, or check, I did it because my therapist told me to do it and therefore it must be safe, or okay, I'm going to do it, but I'm going to think about what I'm going to have for lunch later. today, that those things really take away from the spirit of the exposure. And what we really want to do is keep in mind why we're doing this, which is to really show brain our willingness to tolerate the uncertainty, to tolerate any discomfort that comes to it, that certain things that, even though that these thoughts and feelings are very much unwanted, that we don't have to treat them as dangerous, and we don't have to make choices in our lives based on them, and that we can be in the moment with the discomfort and not like it by any means, but that we might be able to tolerate it more than our brains give us credit for.
Mm-hmm. So how, with some of those things, kind of like white knuckling, when you're just white knuckling through, I love that. I wrote it down. Our brains are calling our bluff. I love it. I love it. And that's happened to me so many times. But when people are, I guess there's two parts to this question. First of all, how often do you run into, as we know, OCD is just it's just the same across the board. Like, as someone who does referral consultations and peer support, I get the same questions all the time, and everybody thinks they're the one person that doesn't have OCD.
Exactly.
Every single person. So, how often do you run into people who, are ready and they're there and they're like, okay, we're ready to do this, and then boom, they're hitting these barriers? Is that typical?
I think it's really, really typical, because therapy is hard because it goes against instinct in that way. Everything in our minds and our bodies are saying, don't walk off that cliff, danger, danger. And essentially with ERP, we're saying, hey, let's do the opposite of that. So I think almost everybody has run into at least some version of this problem at some point, or some people get like a really head start to it, or put their foot on the gas, or really aggressive, and they're like, well, I've done all the exposures that you've suggested, why are these thoughts and feelings still here? Which, again, very natural to want to get rid of uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, right? If we touch the stove and we get burned, our brain's going to be like, stop touching that stove, we don't want you to feel pain anymore. So that happens a lot. So that's why I think it's also really important to not have to do this on your own, and to have a support and guidance of a professional to really kind of walk you through it, because it's not just about kind of going through a checklist of doing things. And because our brains are trying to protect us, they're going to sometimes signal the alarms even louder. So, often, another misconception of therapy is that therapy is supposed to make you feel better in that way. But often with this kind of therapy, people are in for a rude awakening that you're actually feeling worse before you feel better. Yeah. You have to be really willing to do hard things and to tolerate a lot of not feeling great. I always say to people, the therapy is really more about living better. I can help you live better. I can't help you feel better.
Oh, that's great. I like that. I'm going to write that down. Live better, not feel better. No, I used to leave therapy I used to have therapy with Phillipson every Monday. And I actually, the pattern of behavior was so beneficial for me. After the third or fourth week, I was like, wait a minute. Every Monday, I'm always crying. Every Tuesday, I'm always crying. And then Wednesday, I'm like, man, this isn't too bad. And then Thursday, I'm like, actually, this isn't bad at all. Once I realized that, I started to predict every time I see Steve, or every time I was on the phone with him, every time I talk to Steve, I'm in a ball all night. And so
and yet you keep coming back week after week. But that's a sign of like true investment and collaboration and partnership, of just being willing to come back week after week to something that is really hard. But when you really think about it, this is really kind of like a kooky wacky treatment, but most of the things that we really care about in our life require us to feel uncomfortable and do really hard things.
Mm-hmm. That's true. That's a good way to look at it. I do have a question that's maybe off the wall, but just wondering. So a lot of times when people know that they have, or they find out they have OCD, and then they go do all this research that works against them, then they find out they have to do ERP. They also find out that ERP is ego-dystonic and the insight piece, and then all of a sudden people feel like they've lost insight. They're like, I don't have insight that I have OCD. And I'm like, the fact that you say you don't have insight means that you do have insight, by the way, but that doesn't matter. What about people who really do, and this question might not even apply to all this conversation. If it does, no worries. But what about people who really that are diagnosed with OCD coming to treatment and they really struggle with the insight of recognizing OCD. I
Mhm.
don't really know what I'm asking. Just wondering if you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's something called overvalued ideation. We even have a word for that in that
Yes.
way. And for the majority of people, they come in saying like, I know this makes no sense, or I know this is so illogical, but in that moment, it feels like the end of the world. I really feel like I might stab my son in that moment, even though I love my son. I've invested my whole life into trying to take care of him and keep him safe. But that's a huge kind of spectrum, and in terms of how close they are to those thoughts and feelings. And yes, it definitely makes therapy more challenging when the person has less insight and give those thoughts and feelings more relevance even outside of like a more acute OCD episode. And at the same time, we still really use the same treatment strategies. It just requires a little bit more buy-in and more, like I said, laying the foundation about the psychoeducation part of it. And also, if they didn't think they had OCD 100% of the time, then they also wouldn't be here
That's true.
to begin with. It's just some people have more awareness fewer times, more parts of their days or weeks in that
Mm-hmm.
way. But again, even people who would bet their life savings that they have OCD still have moments where they're like, but is this really? Or I didn't tell you this one thing that happened. Maybe this means it's not OCD. Or, okay, that thing that happened yesterday was OCD, but today, different story.
Do you have any suggestions or maybe even advice for people who may be kind of stuck in that insight piece, which of course, people usually have the insight, but then it like, to me, the way I look at it is I can always tell when the insight is just fleeting and it's really blurry almost like, but they live in the blur. And then every
Yeah.
once in a while they come up and they're like, yeah, I know that this isn't it, but that you're so connected to the blurry that it's so hard. Any
Yeah,
suggestion?
absolutely. I think it's about really, if you're working with a therapist that is really kind of doing the therapy the way that it's intended, it's really welcome, at least at the beginning, to challenge that and to ask questions and to really understand why the therapist is giving you the OCD diagnosis in that way, and
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that you're on board with it. And then afterwards, it's really about just making an executive decision to choose to trust and treat it like OCD, even though we don't know with 100% certainty. So at the beginning, it's okay to have those questions and to challenge it, but ultimately it's about kind of designing a map together and ultimately making a choice to follow the map, even though brain is going to show up on that journey and be like, detour, come back. Are you sure you want to do this?
Mm-hmm.
Let's go left. Let's go right. Let's go backwards in that way. And it's just also knowing that it's really normal to deviate and not always have insight and to have doubt, right? Doubt is the hallmark feature of this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. That's helpful, and I think that so many people. I think that I think that's like the hallmark. I feel like of OCD is this anything that you learn about OCD, then it all of a sudden turns against you. it turns
Yeah,
against you, and then creates even a deeper embedded doubt than you even had before. That's what's so hard about it.
exactly. Another one of kind of OCD's tricks that I sometimes see is called like the backdoor spike. So it's when
Oh yeah.
people move forward in the therapy, they progress, do aggressive ERP work, and then suddenly they don't feel as anxious when those thoughts and feelings
Mm-hmm.
come up. And then the OCD part of their brain shows up and is like, oh, see, you don't feel anxious. Maybe this wasn't OCD after all. Maybe you do really want to stab your son, or are attracted to that child, or going to kill yourself, or don't love your partner, or gay, et cetera,
Mm-hmm.
et cetera. So there's no limits to brain's creativity, if there's one thing I learned in this
Backdoor
journey.
spike.
Yeah,
That's my
exactly.
jam.
Yeah.
Uh, so I actually have another like kind of off the wall question, but these are just coming up, and I feel like
No, I
with
love it. Bring them on.
such great clarification for people I think who are struggling. So um, I see this often, not only in people who are in our groups at OCD peers that are going through therapy, but also in doing peer support. Uh, I people, and this happened to me as well. Could you explain a little bit? I don't want to say the phenomenon, but almost, when you get started in therapy and kind of, you have the buy-in, you're trusting the process, and then all of a sudden, like, it's almost like your brain starts screaming so loud, like, and the thoughts get so much worse than you're thinking to yourself, I'm only 3 weeks into therapy and I feel worse than I did before. Could you explain a little bit what the process is there and why that happens to people?
Yeah, well, the first thing I think to know is that that is very natural for that to happen. And that happens for most people most of the time, right? And the reason for that is that even though our brains can sometimes, or especially for people with OCD, but for everyone in general, sometimes our brains can feel like this evil bully who's trying to attack us and make our lives miserable. But the reality is, our brain's number one mission in life is to protect us and keep us safe. And again, they're just misinformed. They're getting their information from a faulty source. So, after the person, especially early on in the therapy, especially if they're being aggressive with it, is starting to kind of rebel against brain and declare independence and saying, like, I'm doing my own
Yes.
thing, brain. Right now, I'm not going to treat these alarm signals as real. Brain's like, whoa, 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 we've spent quite some time warning you that these alarm signals are dangerous. You've spent some time treating them as such. I don't want you to walk off that cliff and die. Let me ring the alarm louder. Let me make the alarms brighter in that way. So, this is just really our brain's way of trying to protect us, because for so long it's believed that whatever the threat is real. And if the person doesn't know that they have OCD or doesn't have the tools, they've reinforced that by treating it as if it's real, right? If the person with the harm OCD spike drops the knife or puts it away, then brain is saying, great job warning him, disaster would happen. So of course the brain's gonna be like, what are you doing with that knife right now?
Mm-hmm. I love this. I'm like, yay, like writing notes. It's so great. Like, I love the rebel and declare independence. I'm probably going to quote you on Instagram later on that one.
Absolutely, go for it. Yeah. But that's also one of the really big misconceptions about that get people stuck in this process, when they're constantly in this tug of war battle with their brains and are fighting their brain. That takes up a lot of time and energy. And if we start kind of trying to be friendly with our brains, or at least treat them as like the roommate that you never signed up to live with, but you're stuck sharing a little room with them. So how can you guys get along? You don't have to be best friends. It's nice if you do, but you don't have to be in that way. Or even sometimes I like to kind of relate it to this idea of, like, if you have a little, like a child or a niece and nephew or a little cousin, and they run into the room and they're screaming, ah, monster under the bed, ah, run, run. Right? Most people in that situation are either going to like chuckle and ignore and move on with their lives, or some people might really feel empathy for the child, that they're actually really scared right now, or might think it's cute that the child is trying to protect themselves, right? Most people aren't going to be cursing out or punching out that child in that way. And I think in some ways our brains is like that child that really believes there's a monster under the bed and is just trying to keep themselves and us safe.
I like that. And this is, again, a little bit deviating, but I think it's an important topic to address. I do, before we end, though, we have like 10 minutes or so, but I do want to get to some of the myths and kind of end on like therapists that may think that ERP is bad. Like, I do want to address that, so we will. But I really think this is an important topic. Just briefly, I don't want to get it too much into my story, but when I was going through ERP, and very much the first probably 10 years after, when I was really stuck in self-stigma, I thought of my brain as the enemy, which did not do me any good for self-worth and self-love and self-compassion. And Steve certainly did not teach me that. He was not like, your brain is the enemy, but there's this self-stigma around, I hate my brain. I hate the things it tells me. I hate that I suffer because of it. And therefore it is the enemy. It's a monster. It's a bully. We all use these terms. And I think when you're in fight mode, yeah, let's look at it as that, because we've got to like make a stand and overcome this. But in the long run, I think it's really dangerous to, and so I really appreciate that you brought up kind of having the empathy for the child, because I did find 10, 12 years after treatment, I just hated myself through and through, because I just wasn't able to cultivate any sort of compassion of like, this is a part of my brain that has a glitch, and every once in a while a pedophile thought comes out and sticks in my executive functioning. I don't see it as that. I see it as my brain is the problem. So I'd love to get some of your thoughts on this. I typically run into, when I'm supporting people with peer support, with these really heavy themes, the pedophilia theme, harm theme, scrupulosity, when it's messing with your eternity over here. Like, people really can do the work, but then really struggle with maybe the gap before kind of the radical acceptance, which I think takes so much work to get to. How do you cultivate, or do you have any thoughts or suggestions on people on how to cultivate self-worth, esteem, and self-compassion when you have lived for years with the most horrible, tormenting, disgusting thoughts?
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really excellent question. I think you're not alone. I think that describes so many people's journey in this experience. And to kind of sum up the answer to that question in, a sentence is that you are not your brain. We are not our brains, right? Even people with or without OCD, we all have unwanted thoughts and feelings, and we don't sign up for them, right? And judging ourselves for OCD thoughts are the same as like judging ourselves for the weather. Like, I really suck today because it's been raining all day, right? That would be a silly thing for me to say because I didn't wake up this morning and channel the weather gods to make it rain all day. We are not our brains. Our brains are independent. And the more we give them permission to be independent, the freer we'll be from
Mm.
those experiences. And I think that also, to kind of add on to that, is this concept of the radical acceptance that you're talking about, which is a really integral part of therapy where a lot of people get stuck because of misconceptions about what acceptance is, right? Accepting these thoughts and feelings is not liking them. It's not condoning them. Accepting them is the way that we accept that it's raining, right? I don't like that it's raining. It's maybe affecting my mood. It's maybe making it harder for me to go somewhere, but I'm not going to sit there, look out the window and be like, why is it raining? It needs to stop raining. Or I'm not going to be doing my potion to try to make the rain stop in that way. And a lot of people also, particularly when they have some of the more taboo themes like pedophilia, homicide, they're like, well, what do you mean you want me to accept my thoughts? Like, you're saying, okay,
Yes.
it's okay if I'm a pedophile? Like, what?
Yes.
That's not part of my values. What are you talking about in that way? And we're not working on saying, like, no big deal if you go molest some kids tomorrow, whatever. We're working on accepting that these thoughts are the brain. They're an independent system and they're just thoughts. And we're just going to take those thoughts and put them in a very, very large box of all the mysteries and all the uncertainties of life and all the things that we don't know about, but we're just choosing to accept not knowing. And that's really the key there, that we're working on accepting not knowing versus accepting the content of the thoughts to be true in that way,
Oh,
right? Like, a meteor can hit the earth right this moment, and we're not saying like no big deal if that happens, whatever. Like, no, that would be probably pretty catastrophic. In that way, we're just saying we're not going to sit here with helmets on our head or look out the window every second. We're going to let that be one of many possibilities of things that may or may not happen, and we're going to sit here and focus on this conversation, being in the room together, etc.
oh, I am so appreciative, accepting that, not knowing it, accepting not knowing it, not accepting that it may or may not be true. Because I think this is something that I've just been at a loss for, just in knowing how to, and I also think it intertwines with the insight piece. So
Mm-hmm.
people get so jaded when they find out, as it, you read stuff on social media, it's like, just accept the thoughts. And people with POCD are like,
Mm.
no. Like, at the
Yeah.
end of the day, I'm not going to accept that I could possibly molest my children tonight. The end. And that really messes with people's insights.
Yeah. So again, we're not saying cool, no big deal if you're a pedophile. We're just saying we don't know. And there's lots of things we don't know, which is probably everything in our lives to some extent or another. And we're just going to treat it that way. And I think also, one of the tricks to OCD is really practicing deeming the content to be irrelevant. I think people get so caught up on their particular theme or the trick of like, this time is different versus they all follow a similar formula, right? And our training as OCD specialists, we aren't trained on one particular theme. We're trained on the different strategies because they're applicable. And I, tell people, like, as much as I genuinely really love working with you, our goal is not to grow old together, but to really have you become equipped with the tools to manage the OCD, to understand it, so that whatever creative version of this thoughts are going to come up throughout your life, you're going to know what to do, right? It's even if we have booster sessions later, we're not starting from scratch. We're not treating a new thing. We're just
Right.
meeting brain wherever it's at in that moment.
So last question before we get into the myths.
I mean, we have been talking about the myths. A lot of these are.
Oh no, I do want to, because I do want to. What if people like, often people will get behavioral therapy and then they leave therapy a little bit empowered of like, yay, I'm cured. Or they might think they're cured. Then, relapse, of course, brings us back down to earth, and then we have to revisit the tools. But sometimes people may experience that and then feel a lot of grief and possibly uncover some trauma that OCD has caused them in their life. What would you suggest people do if they've had successful behavioral therapy but continue to feel stuck by the emotional piece of OCD?
Yeah. You mean the emotional piece from before of how much
If
pain
they're
the
still,
OCD has
yeah, if
brought
they're
to
still
their life?
struggling, if they're still dealing with just, the trauma of living for 2 decades, with your brain beating you up, what would you suggest people do, or how can they seek more help that's maybe different from behavioral therapy, not for OCD,
Yeah.
but just for kind of the emotional scarring of it?
Absolutely. Well, again, I think the first step is just owning it and making room for it as a very real part of a very difficult journey. For most people, it takes them a long time, sometimes several therapists, sometimes many years to really get to the place where they have the treatment that's the best fit for them. And often the journey there is really hard and requires going through a lot of pain and loss. And that grief is really normal and really, really healthy to experience. So I'd say the most important things that the person can do is to validate it for themselves and practice compassion for themselves for it. But of course, easier said than done. And I think that it could be the second part of the journey. And I think a lot of people have, also this idea that like OCD therapy, you go and you just treat the OCD and you say, check, done, you get a certificate and you're done. And for some people, that is their journey. But a lot of times, once they have some space from those intrusive thoughts and feelings, that's when the other things that have just been covered by brain constantly being in fight or flight mode come up, and there's room in that therapy to explore it further and learn how to accept and move forward and grieve and learn to be kind to ourselves about that, about learning how to rebuild our lives, how to not get stuck in the should have, would have, could have lands. And they can definitely do that sometimes with the person that they're working with for OCD therapy. And sometimes people seek therapy, another relationship for another person to focus on other challenges that might come up. And also, that's one of the exciting things, right? Like sometimes people are like, I worked so hard and I better manage my OCD, but now I have to deal with both the
Mm-hmm.
implications of some of the ways that the OCD had their relationship with the OCD has led to some loss in their life. And then sometimes things not even related to the OCD come up, but that they just haven't given themselves the space to deal with. And that's hard in other ways. And I think it's also really valuable if now they have the space to explore that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and another way would be, not to plug myself and what I do, but I am going to.
Go for it. You're
um,
doing great work.
Community is very, very helpful in that space of grief. OCD is so isolating. So when graduate OCD therapy, and then you maybe feel this, oh my gosh, that I have all this time, but I'm still feeling the shame, and I'm still, meeting people through our, OCD peers groups, doing one-on-one peer support. There's several of us out there that are certified and trained. Make sure the person is certified and trained. Don't exchange money unless someone's certified. Um, but, that can really be healing too. It can really help cultivate compassion and self-love. If I can look at someone else, and Steve is so good at this, like it was like 1998, I think it was before HIPAA, but he like connected me with another one of his clients, and who was in New York and I was in Georgia, and we got to chat on the phone. Like back then there was no video or anything, and like he mailed me a photo of himself and I mailed him a photo. It was like, oh my gosh, this guy in New York is going through the same thing, with the same age, and it was motivating, it was healing, it was amazing. So community is also a big part of healing. So and that's what
Huge.
OCD Gamechangers is here for, to create that community, to get you the information and connect you to people. So I do want to touch on this because I think it's really important. There's so many misconceptions out there about what a ERP is, and if you're watching today, I hope that you hear like how how the process works. It is not abusive. it's it's not this horrible process that's going to scar people for life. Sure, if you're with a therapist who says they do ERP and they're full throttle, let's go watch porn the first time, that might not be the right fit. um but
We
let's just
reserve the porn watching for like session number 10 usually, so gotta
I
build up to
know,
that.
I remember. But what are some of the things that, because as we know, therapists in the field might say, well, I'm not going to do that because it's inhumane. So what are some of the myths about ERP? And let's dispel them right here.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the things that we've already even talked about just in our brief talk today, which is, the goal of therapy is not to cure the OCD and get rid of those thoughts and feelings, but really learning how to have a better relationship with them, about really focusing on that. The goal of therapy, the goal of doing the exposures isn't just to white knuckle it, get through it, or to distract yourself, but really embrace the spirit of the exposure.
Mm-hmm.
I think another myth is, again, that we need to fight the OCD, we need to fight our brains, we need to win that tug of war battle, but instead we're really learning how to be better roommates with our brain, how to let go of some of the hostility of it. The other myth I think that we talked about was that acceptance doesn't mean liking or condoning these
Mm-hmm.
experiences. I think to your point before about sometimes, like, yeah, to the outside person who doesn't have the foundation, or even the therapist who doesn't have the expertise in the OCD, some of the exposures might seem really wacky and out there.
And dangerous, or like
And
from a
dangerous.
liability perspective.
Sure, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I think understanding why we're doing it is really important. And often, with really effective exposure therapy, we do kind of go above and beyond sort of what the average person does. And I think one of the myths is like, well, I need to only do the things that I'm avoiding that most people do. But with ERP, there is sometimes value in going above and beyond. And I like to use, the metal pole metaphor of, if we have a metal pole and we want it to be straight and it's bent this way, sometimes we need to bend it the other way to eventually get it straight.
Yeah.
And we need to take it's sometimes valuable to take a more aggressive approach, right? So if someone has contamination OCD, it's not just about, generally like touching a doorknob the way that most people do. Sometimes we might want to touch the floor and lick it, or touch garbage or whatnot, or things in the bathroom that maybe the average person doesn't do, because we need to really show brain in a more aggressive way that we're going to increase our risk tolerance and let uncertainty be uncertain.
Yeah, excellent. And one last thing before final thoughts. I think I also, will hear often that therapists that aren't trained to treat OCD with ERP will say, well, because OCD is born out of, or OCD is trauma. And so we need to treat it with trauma therapy. So that's incorrect, correct?
You're correct that it's incorrect. And while the experience of having OCD and experiencing high levels of anxiety or isolation or avoiding things that might lead you to miss certain parts of living your life could be really traumatic and really painful, but OCD does not come from trauma. And I would say even the majority of people that I work with have not had a trauma. OCD, one of the things I think is really interesting about it is it doesn't discriminate, right? It's one of the few disorders that affects men and women equally, that it doesn't discriminate by nationality or socioeconomic class, that it's really fair game for everyone. And there's plenty of people that I work with that have had lovely childhoods and no trauma and had a lot of resources, and they're still experiencing a tremendous amount of suffering. And yes, while certain difficult life stressors can maybe bring on some of the symptoms or make them harder to deal with, OCD is not caused by a trauma.
Right. such an awful misconception, and people then start to explore why they have the thoughts that they do, and it can really just make a bigger web than OCD already makes. So
Exactly. And sometimes trying to uncover the origin can actually feed into
yes.
the OCD and give it more legitimacy.
So thank you for being here today.
My
This was
pleasure.
such a fun episode. A lot of it I feel great because it just validates the things that I say. So it makes me feel more legitimate. But also, I just feel like our listeners and the viewers, they're really going to learn a lot. I think we touched on some topics that people really get stuck on. So I want to end with kind of your final thoughts. If someone's watching today and they're really kind of stuck in some of these barriers, or they're just really hesitant to even start, what is something that you would like to tell them to give them a little hope and motivation and encouragement to just take that leap?
Absolutely. So it could be having OCD can be a really lonely experience, and you're not alone. There's so many people that are going through this. And I think especially now with the amazing progress that we've made in the online community, thanks to people like you and, Made of Millions and all these other organizations that are doing amazing work to bring awareness to just how prevalent this is and how many resources there are out there. And therapy, even though, as we've talked about, and as people kind of get from just reading about it, it's not easy by any means. It requires doing a lot of hard work and even feeling worse before feeling better. It's effective. And I've seen people just get their lives back and get freedom from OCD. And I think the most important thing is to know that they also don't have to do it alone, that there are people now more than ever, experts out there that can help really guide them through the journey. And if they find somebody that they really trust, that knows what they're doing, that could be an invaluable asset in going through that journey together in that way. And yeah, that.
Great. Well, if anyone's in the New York area and they want to do therapy with you, how can they reach you?
Sure, absolutely. So they can go on my website, cbtforbetterliving.com, and there's the contact information, or they can email me at cbtforbetterliving@gmail.com. And we're currently seeing patients in New York and New Jersey.
Yay. Well, thank you so much. This has been such a fun and informative episode. I really feel like people are going to get a lot out of it. And thank you for what you do for our community and so many of us. And you're just so appreciated, for all the people that you're helping, and now helping even more to hopefully motivate people to take that next step.
Thank you so much. It was so amazing being here and talking to you. And thank you for all the amazing work that you're doing. It's honestly inspiring, amazing, just bringing the community together. And I think it's absolutely invaluable to so many people out there. So it's been my honor talking to you today. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Hopefully it won't be the last time. We'll do this again.
Sounds good.
And for all of you watching, and Mark just chimed in from Sydney, Australia. Yay, Mark! Thank you for being here. For all of you who joined us for this Fireside Friday, thank you so much for being here. Please consider donating to OCD Game Changers to further these programs you're doing to bring community together, bring education out there, and just further connect you to people that are going to help you walk this journey and feel less alone. We will be here Monday with Dr. Ashley Smith from Monday Mavericks. We're going to be an hour later, which is actually going to be 2 hours later since there's a time change. um, but technically, we're going to be at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Ashley Smith. Looking forward to it. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Turn your clocks back this weekend, don't forget. And again, please consider donating to OCD Game Changers, because we love being part of this community, and we want to continue serving and walking alongside you through your journey toward recovery with OCD. Have a great weekend.
Bye. Take care.